I'm Melissa Cooper, 36, and I worked my way up from enlisted to officer the slow, quiet way. For years, I carried my family and kept the peace. But when my brother-in-law stood up at dinner, slapped my shoulder, and called me a coward, I made a choice that changed everything. Ever been humiliated by someone you've supported for years? Tell me in the comments, you're not alone. Before I get into it, tell me where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to draw a hard line and take your dignity back, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and quiet justice. What happened next might surprise you. Andrew had always been the type to push boundaries. Not in any obvious way that would get him called out directly, but in those small, persistent ways that wore at you over time. He'd arrive 20 minutes late to family dinners, shrug when my sister apologized for him, then spend the evening making jokes that landed just on the edge of acceptable. The first time I noticed his pattern, we were at my parents' house for Sunday dinner. He'd been married to Sarah for about 6 months then, still in that phase where family was trying to figure out how he fit. My father had asked me about my recent assignment overseas, something routine but classified enough that I kept my answers general. Andrew leaned back in his chair, beer in hand, and said, "Must be nice having a job where you can't talk about what you do." Real convenient excuse. Everyone laughed. It was meant to sound like teasing, the kind brothers-in-law do. But I caught the edge underneath, the way he was testing to see how I'd react. I didn't react at all. That seemed to annoy him more than if I'd pushed back. Over the next year, the comments got more frequent. Little digs about military life, about following orders, about whether I'd ever made a decision for myself. Always delivered with that same half-smile, always in front of family where making a scene would be awkward. Sarah would sometimes shoot him a look, but she never said anything directly. Neither did anyone else. The thing about Andrew was that he played a different game with different audiences. At work, he was charm itself. I'd seen him at company events Sarah dragged me to. Respectful to his boss, helpful to his colleagues, the kind of guy who remembered birthdays and contributed to office pools. He saved his testing for home, for family, for people he thought wouldn't push back. I started paying closer attention to when it happened. Usually after he'd been out with his crew, a group of guys from his gym who seemed to feed off each other's worst impulses. They'd go out drinking, come back full of stories about who they'd told off, who they'd put in their place. Andrew would show up to family events the next day with that particular swagger that comes from group validation, ready to see how far he could push with us. My mother loved him, of course. He was good to Sarah, brought flowers, remembered to compliment her cooking. He was the kind of son-in-law who looked perfect on paper. The disrespect was subtle enough that calling it out would make me look petty, sensitive, unable to take a joke. But it was building. Each comment, each test, each moment where he gauged whether I'd let it slide. I could see him gaining confidence, pushing incrementally further each time. The way he'd watch my face when he made his remarks, looking for cracks, for signs that he was getting under my skin. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday. Sarah called me, upset about something at work. Her boss had humiliated her in a meeting, questioned her competence in front of clients. She was crying, asking if I thought she should quit, if she was overreacting. I listened, gave her what reassurance I could, helped her think through her options. When I mentioned it to Andrew later, thinking he might want to know his wife had been struggling, he shrugged. "She's too sensitive. Always has been. Probably wasn't as bad as she made it sound." No concern, no anger on her behalf. Just dismissal. That's when I understood what I was dealing with. The testing, the boundary pushing, it wasn't about me specifically. It was about hierarchy. Andrew needed to know where he stood in every relationship, needed to establish that he wasn't at the bottom of any pecking order. The realization came with a certain clarity. I'd been treating his behavior as personal antagonism when it was actually something more systematic. He was working through the family, finding everyone's pressure points, establishing his position relative to each of us. With my parents, he was the devoted son-in-law. With Sarah, he was the protective husband who knew better than she did about most things. With me, he was testing whether military discipline translated to personal passivity. I started documenting the pattern more carefully. Not writing anything down, just paying attention. The correlation between his nights out with the gym crew and his next-day aggression was nearly perfect. The way he'd escalate gradually, watching for my response threshold. The calculation behind what looked like casual rudeness. Sarah mentioned once that he'd been talking about me to his friends, sharing stories about family dinners, about my robot act, as he called it. She thought I should know, thought maybe I could talk to him directly. She didn't understand that talking to him would only give him more material, more ways to position himself as the reasonable one dealing with an oversensitive brother-in-law. The final build-up started in March. Andrew had gotten a promotion at work, something that had inflated his confidence. He'd started interrupting me more during conversations, dismissing my opinions more openly. The testing was becoming performance, less about gauging my reactions and more about demonstrating his dominance to anyone watching. I could have addressed it then. Should have, probably. But I was curious to see how far he'd push, what his endgame looked like. There's a certain value in letting someone reveal their full hand before you respond. In my line of work, patience is often the difference between successful operations and unnecessary complications. Besides, I was learning things about family dynamics that I hadn't understood before. How much everyone else had been walking on eggshells around his moods, how Sarah had started moderating her own opinions to avoid his dismissal, how even my parents had begun gauging their comments based on his likely reactions. Andrew was reshaping the entire family system around his need for dominance, and everyone was adapting to accommodate him. Everyone except me. I wasn't adapting because I wasn't bothered, and my lack of reaction was driving him to escalate. By April, I could see the breaking point approaching. His comments were getting less subtle, his audience playing more obvious. He was building towards something bigger, some moment where he could establish his position definitively. All I had to do was wait. The night Sarah mentioned that Andrew had been asking questions about my security clearance, about what kind of authority I actually had, I knew we were close. He wasn't just testing anymore. He was researching. Planning something that would require him to understand exactly who he was challenging. I respected the thoroughness, even as I recognized the threat. Andrew wasn't stupid, just inexperienced. He was about to learn the difference between those two things. The family gathering was already scheduled for the weekend. Perfect timing, really. Large enough audience, casual enough setting, everyone relaxed and off guard. If Andrew was planning his big moment, that's where it would happen. I made sure to arrive early, to be settled and comfortable when he walked in. Sometimes the best strategy is simply being exactly where you're supposed to be when everything else falls apart. Sarah looked nervous when they arrived. She kept glancing between Andrew and me, like she sensed something building but couldn't name it. Andrew looked confident, energized, ready for whatever he'd been planning. I just waited. The moment came during dessert. We were all sitting around my parents' dining room table, the conversation light and wandering. My father had just finished telling a story about his golf game, and Sarah was asking my mother about her garden plans for spring. Normal family dinner, everyone relaxed. Andrew had been quieter than usual through dinner, but I could feel his attention on me. He'd make eye contact when he thought I wasn't looking, that same evaluating stare he got when he was calculating his next move. His energy was different tonight, more focused, more purposeful. When the conversation hit a natural lull, he made his move. "You know what I've been wondering about?" Andrew said, his voice carrying that casual tone he used when he was about to say something designed to cut. All these stories about military service, all this respect for discipline and honor. But what does that actually mean? The table went quiet. Not uncomfortable yet, just attentive. My parents looked interested, Sarah looked wary. I said nothing. I mean, following orders isn't exactly heroic, right? It's just doing what you're told. Like a good soldier. The way he said "good soldier" made it sound like an insult. Takes more courage to think for yourself, make your own decisions. Still nothing from me. I was watching everyone else's faces, seeing how they were processing this. My father looked confused, not sure if this was going somewhere. My mother was starting to frown. Andrew was building to something bigger. I could see it in his posture, the way he was positioning himself in his chair. He'd rehearsed this. The real question is what happens when someone can't hide behind rank, behind orders, behind the whole system. What are they actually made of when it's just them? Sarah put her hand on his arm. Andrew. He shook her off gently, never taking his eyes off me. No, it's a fair question. We're all family here. We should be able to have honest conversations. What exactly are you asking? My father said. Andrew smiled then, that predatory expression I'd seen him use when he thought he had someone cornered. I'm asking if someone who's spent their whole life following orders knows how to show real courage when it matters. Or if they're just... He paused, let the moment build. A coward. The word hung in the air. Andrew let it sit there, watching my face for a reaction. When I didn't give him one, his confidence grew. That's what it is, isn't it? All the military stuff, all the discipline, it's just a way to avoid making real choices. Hide in the system, let other people make the hard decisions. He was warming up now, feeding off his own momentum. Real courage is standing up, speaking your mind, not waiting for permission. My mother started to say something, but Andrew was rolling. I mean, look at tonight. I'm sitting here calling you a coward to your face, and what are you doing? Nothing. Just sitting there like a good little soldier, waiting for orders that aren't coming. That's when he stood up, reached over, and slapped my shoulder. Hard enough to rock me forward, casual enough to look playful if you weren't paying attention to the force behind it. Come on, show us some of that military courage. Or are you just going to sit there like always? The table was dead silent. My mother looked horrified. My father was starting to stand up, his face red. Sarah was pulling on Andrew's arm, telling him to stop. But Andrew was triumphant. He'd finally gotten the reaction he wanted from everyone except me, and my lack of response was the best response he could have asked for. Proof of everything he'd been building toward. That's what I thought, he said, settling back into his chair with the satisfaction of a man who'd just proven his point conclusively. I looked around the table. Sarah was staring at her plate, ashamed. My parents were angry, but clearly didn't know how to respond to this level of disrespect in their own home. Andrew was basking in the silence, reading it as victory. I finished my dessert. Asked my mother about her recipe. Complimented the wine my father had chosen. Had a perfectly normal conversation while Andrew watched, first confused, then frustrated, then increasingly agitated as he realized his big moment wasn't having the effect he'd anticipated. When dinner ended, I helped clear the table. Thanked my parents for a lovely evening. Kissed Sarah goodbye, told her I'd call her tomorrow. Said nothing at all to Andrew, not because I was avoiding him, but because there was simply nothing that needed to be said. I drove home through quiet suburban streets, thinking about leverage and timing, about the difference between reaction and response. Andrew had shown his hand completely now. More importantly, he'd done it in front of witnesses, making sure everyone in the family understood exactly what he thought of me, exactly how far he was willing to go. That was useful information. When I got home, I poured myself a drink and sat in my study. On my desk was a secure phone that connected directly to personnel command. I'd used it hundreds of times over the years for routine business, staffing questions, operational planning. Tonight, I used it to make a single call. The conversation was brief, professional, entirely within normal protocols. There was a need for experienced personnel in a forward deployment. I had recommendations for someone who might be suitable, someone looking for opportunities to prove himself, to show real courage under pressure. Andrew had been asking about my authority, about what kind of influence I actually had. Tomorrow, he'd start getting answers to those questions. I finished my drink and went to bed. In the morning, there would be paperwork to process, orders to generate, a deployment to arrange. But all of that was just mechanics. The real work had already been done. Andrew had chosen his position, defined himself in relation to me and our family, established the rules of engagement. Now we'd see how his definition of courage held up under real pressure, in a place where following orders wasn't optional and making your own decisions could get people killed. I'd spent years learning that the most effective responses are often the quietest ones, that real authority doesn't need to announce itself. Andrew was about to get the same education. I slept well that night. People think military service is about combat, about dramatic moments under fire. For most of us, it's actually about something more mundane, the slow accumulation of competence, the gradual understanding of how systems work and how to work within them. I'd enlisted straight out of high school, not because I had some burning patriotic calling, but because college felt abstract and I wanted to do something concrete. The recruiter had talked about travel, about training, about opportunities to serve. What he hadn't mentioned was that the real education would be in patience, in discipline, in understanding the difference between authority and power. Boot camp taught me to follow orders. My first deployment taught me why those orders mattered. My second deployment taught me how to give orders that people would follow not because they had to, but because they trusted my judgment. By my third deployment, I was the person other people came to when they needed problems solved quietly, efficiently, without drama. The progression wasn't dramatic. No single moment of transformation, no crisis that revealed hidden reserves of courage. Just the steady accumulation of competence, of trust, of the kind of authority that comes from consistently making good decisions under pressure. My sister Sarah had been there for most of it, watching from the outside as I moved through the ranks, as my responsibilities grew. As the family dinner conversation shifted from me talking about what I was learning to me deflecting questions about what I couldn't discuss. She understood, better than most, the weight of the clearances I held, the nature of the work I did. Which made Andrew's performance at dinner even more pointed. This wasn't just about challenging me, it was about challenging the family's understanding of who I was, what I'd accomplished, what I represented in our shared history. Sarah had called me after I'd gotten my first commendation, crying because she was proud and worried at the same time. Proud because she knew what the recognition meant, worried because she was starting to understand the risks I was taking to earn it. I'd tried to reassure her, to explain that most of the work was planning and logistics, that the dangerous moments were rare and carefully managed. But that wasn't entirely true. There had been dangerous moments, times when my decisions had direct consequences for people's lives. Times when the weight of command meant accepting responsibility not just for success, but for failure, for injuries, for the families who wouldn't see their loved ones again. Those experiences change you in ways that are hard to explain to people who haven't lived them. Not dramatically, you don't come back transformed into some Hollywood version of a warrior. You just develop a different relationship with risk, with responsibility, with the difference between what needs to be said and what needs to be done. Andrew couldn't have known about the deployment where my intelligence work prevented an ambush that would have killed 12 people. He couldn't have known about the months I'd spent coordinating evacuations of civilian personnel from conflict zones, or the commendations I'd received for operations I still couldn't discuss publicly. But he could have known, should have known, that dismissing someone's service record as cowardice was not just insulting but ignorant. The military doesn't promote cowards. Combat zones don't reward hesitation. The responsibilities I held, the clearances I maintained, the trust placed in my judgment, all of that was earned through demonstrated competence under pressure. Sarah knew. She'd seen the letters, the awards, the quiet recognition from superior officers who understood what my work had accomplished. She'd also seen the cost, the relationships that didn't survive deployment schedules, the social awkwardness that comes from not being able to talk about significant portions of your life, the weight of carrying classified information that could affect national security. When I'd helped Andrew get his first job after college, connecting him with a contractor who needed someone with his skill set, I wasn't being generous. I was being practical. Family cohesion matters, and Andrew needed to feel like he was contributing, like he had value beyond his role as Sarah's husband. But Andrew had interpreted my help as evidence of my influence, and my influence as something he could leverage or challenge depending on his needs. He'd been asking Sarah questions about my work, about my connections, about what doors I might be able to open for him if he played his cards right. The irony was that he'd been right to be curious. I did have influence, did have connections, did have the ability to affect people's careers and opportunities. The mistake he'd made was assuming that influence worked the way he thought it did, through favoritism, through personal relationships, through the kind of backroom dealing he'd seen in civilian corporate environments. Military influence works differently. It's based on competence, on trust, on a track record of making decisions that serve larger objectives rather than personal interests. When I made recommendations, they carried weight because people knew I didn't make them lightly, Didn't use my position for personal benefit. Andrew had spent months positioning himself as someone who deserved my help, my connections, my influence in advancing his career. He'd been building up to asking for something significant, some favor that would demonstrate my loyalty to him as family. Instead, he'd chosen to challenge me publicly, to frame our relationship as a test of courage rather than a matter of mutual respect. In doing so, he'd forced me to demonstrate exactly what kind of influence I actually had and how I chose to use it. The thing about military justice is that it's both more flexible and more absolute than civilian justice. More flexible because it can adapt to operational needs, can prioritize mission requirements over individual preferences. More absolute because once decisions are made, they're implemented without appeal to higher authorities who might be more sympathetic to personal circumstances. Andrew would learn this distinction soon enough. The deployment I'd arranged for him wasn't punishment, exactly. It was opportunity, the same opportunity I'd had to prove myself under pressure, to demonstrate whether his definitions of courage and cowardice held up when tested by reality rather than family dinner conversations. If he was right about me, if military service really was just institutionalized cowardice, then he should thrive in that environment. If he was wrong, if courage actually meant something different than he'd assumed, then he'd learn that too. Either way, he'd get the chance to test his theories under conditions where the stakes were real, where following orders was a matter of survival, where making your own decisions could have consequences beyond hurt feelings and awkward family gatherings. I respected him enough to give him that chance. Whether he'd respect the education remained to be seen. The call came through on Wednesday morning while I was reviewing deployment schedules for the quarter. Andrew's name appeared on the list I was updating, flagged for immediate processing. Personnel command had moved faster than I'd expected, but then again, the need was real and his qualifications were suitable. I set the paperwork aside and spent the rest of the morning thinking about consequences, about the difference between justice and revenge. What I'd done wasn't revenge. Revenge would have been personal, emotional, designed to cause maximum suffering. This was more like natural selection, creating conditions where Andrew could demonstrate what he was actually made of when stripped of his support systems and forced to rely on his own competence. Sarah called that afternoon, upset about something at work again. Her boss was still giving her trouble, questioning her decisions, undermining her authority with clients. She was thinking about looking for a new job, but worried about starting over, about explaining to interviewers why she'd left her current position. "You know what Andrew said when I told him about it," she said. "He said I should just quit if I can't handle the pressure. Said maybe I'm not cut out for management-level work." I listened to her describe the conversation, the casual dismissal of her concerns, the suggestion that her professional struggles were evidence of personal weakness rather than a hostile work environment. It was the same dynamic I'd observed at family dinners, the same pattern of establishing dominance through diminishment. "What do you think I should do?" she asked. "Document everything," I told her. "Dates, times, witnesses. Build a case. Then decide whether you want to fight or find somewhere better to work. But whatever you decide, make sure it's your decision, not someone else's opinion of what you're capable of handling." She was quiet for a moment. "Andrew thinks I'm too sensitive. Says I take things too personally." "Andrew isn't the one dealing with your boss. His opinion isn't relevant." Another pause. "You've never liked him much, have you?" The question caught me off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because it assumed a level of emotional investment that wasn't accurate. "It's not about liking him. It's about respecting the people I care about." "What does that mean?" "It means someone who dismisses your professional judgment, who minimizes your concerns, who treats your struggles as evidence of weakness. That person isn't showing you respect. And if he's not showing you respect, then I don't need to show him respect either." Sarah went quiet. When she spoke again, her voice was different, more thoughtful. "He's been different lately. More aggressive. I thought maybe it was stress from work, but—" She didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. She was starting to see the pattern, starting to recognize that Andrew's behavior wasn't situational, but systematic. The realization was uncomfortable because it meant acknowledging that problems she'd attributed to external circumstances were actually internal to her relationship. "Has he said anything about Sunday dinner?" I asked. He thinks you were being passive-aggressive. Said you were playing some kind of game, acting superior. She paused. He's proud of himself for calling you out. Of course he was. In his mind, he'd won a victory, established dominance, proven his point about courage and cowardice. He had no idea what victory actually looked like when deployed against someone with real authority, real influence, real ability to shape circumstances rather than just react to them. Sarah, can I ask you something? Sure. When you were having problems with your boss, did you want Andrew to be proud of you for handling it, or did you want him to help you figure out solutions? Long pause. I wanted him to care. To be angry on my behalf. To act like it mattered to him that someone was treating me badly. And instead, he acted like it was my fault. Like I should just be tougher. That was the difference between support and judgment, between partnership and dominance. Andrew saw Sarah's struggles as opportunities to demonstrate his superior judgment, to position himself as the strong one in their relationship. I saw her struggles as problems to be solved, obstacles to be removed from the path of someone I cared about. The deployment orders will come through soon, I said. What deployment orders? I'd spoken without thinking, operating on the assumption that Andrew would have mentioned his upcoming deployment to his wife. The fact that he hadn't suggested he either didn't know yet or knew and was planning to present it as something that had happened to him rather than something he'd provoked. He'll explain when he's ready, I said. But I could hear Sarah's concern, her growing awareness that there were conversations happening around her that she wasn't part of, decisions being made that would affect her life without her input. That was Andrew's approach to their relationship: manage the information flow, control the narrative, present conclusions rather than include her in the decision-making process. It was also about to become his introduction to military life, where information was controlled by people with authority he couldn't challenge, where decisions were made based on operational needs rather than personal preferences, where his opinions about what he could and couldn't handle were irrelevant to the requirements of the mission. The irony was perfect. Andrew had spent months establishing his dominance over Sarah by treating her concerns as evidence of weakness, her struggles as proof that she needed his guidance to navigate a world she wasn't tough enough to handle on her own. Now he was about to experience what it felt like to have someone else make decisions about his life based on their assessment of what he could handle, what he was qualified for, what he needed to prove about himself. The deployment wasn't punishment. It was education. Andrew had asked questions about courage, about authority, about what it meant to make real decisions under pressure. He was about to get comprehensive answers to all of those questions. Whether he'd like the answers was a different matter entirely. I have to go, Sarah said. Andrew is home. After she hung up, I sat in my office thinking about family dynamics, about the ways people establish and maintain power in their relationships, about the difference between respect earned and respect demanded. Andrew had been operating from a position of assumed authority, treating his opinions as more valid than other people's experiences, his judgments as more reliable than their self-knowledge. That approach works in environments where people choose to accommodate it, where challenging the assumption is more trouble than it's worth, where the cost of conflict outweighs the benefit of resistance. It doesn't work in environments where authority is real rather than assumed, where competence is measured by results rather than by confidence, where the consequences of poor judgment extend beyond hurt feelings to operational failure and personal danger. Andrew was about to discover which kind of environment he was entering and whether his understanding of courage, leadership, and personal strength would translate to conditions where those qualities were tested by reality rather than evaluated by people who had their own reasons for not challenging his self-assessment. I respected him enough to give him that opportunity. The rest was up to him. Thursday morning brought the usual routine: coffee, briefings, the careful review of operational schedules that had become second nature after years of managing complex deployments. But there was an undercurrent of anticipation, a sense of pieces falling into place that added weight to otherwise mundane tasks. Andrews still didn't know. The orders were processed, approved, and ready for delivery, but Personnel Command followed standard protocols for notification. He'd receive them at work, during business hours, delivered by courier to ensure official receipt and immediate acknowledgement. I found myself thinking about timing, about the psychology of receiving life-changing information in different contexts. At home, surrounded by familiar things and support systems, people can process shock gradually, can take time to adjust their understanding of what's happening to them. At work, in front of colleagues, with professional obligations demanding immediate composure, the adjustment has to happen quickly, cleanly, without the luxury of private reaction. Andrew would get his orders at his office, in the marketing firm where he'd built his reputation as someone who could handle pressure, who made smart decisions under deadline stress. His colleagues would see him receive official military documents, would watch his face as he processed the contents, would gauge his reaction to determine how concerned they should be about losing him to deployment. It was a perfect test of his own definitions. If he really believed that civilian courage was superior to military discipline, if he really thought that making your own decisions was more challenging than following orders, then he should be able to handle the transition smoothly, professionally, with the kind of grace under pressure that he'd been claiming to possess. Sarah called during my lunch break, her voice tight with anxiety. Andrew got some kind of official letter at work today. Military letterhead. He won't tell me what it says, just keeps saying he needs to make some phone calls, figure some things out. So he knew now. The moment I'd been waiting for, the point where his theoretical courage would meet practical consequences. Did he seem upset? He seemed. She paused, searching for the right word. Scared. Not angry, not frustrated. Scared. I've never seen him look like that before. That was interesting. I'd expected anger first, then denial, then the kind of bargaining that comes when people realize they've miscalculated the power dynamics in their situation. Fear suggested he understood immediately what he was looking at, recognized the authority behind the orders, grasped the reality of what was about to happen to him. He keeps asking me questions about you, Sarah continued. About your job, about who you know, about what kind of influence you might have. He seems to think this is connected to Sunday dinner somehow. Of course he did. Andrew was smart enough to recognize the timing, to connect his public challenge with the sudden appearance of deployment orders. What he was probably struggling with was the scope of the response, the efficiency with which consequences had materialized, the realization that authority he dismissed as theoretical was actually quite practical. What kind of questions? He wants to know if you've ever talked about him, if you've mentioned his name to anyone at work. He's convinced you have some kind of security clearance that gives you access to personnel records, that you've been watching him somehow. Andrew is giving me too much credit, and not enough at the same time. Too much credit for surveillance and manipulation, not enough credit for the simple mechanics of military personnel management. I hadn't needed to watch him or investigate his background. His own behavior at family dinner had provided all the information necessary to assess his readiness for deployment, his suitability for combat assignment, his need for real-world experience, testing his theories about courage and leadership. Sarah, has Andrew ever talked to you about wanting military experience? About proving himself in combat situations? What? No. Why would he want that? Just wondering. He seemed interested in comparing civilian and military approaches to courage. I thought maybe he'd expressed interest in first-hand experience. Long pause. You're scaring me. What's happening? I realized I'd pushed too far, revealed too much of my own process. Sarah was caught between her husband and her brother, trying to understand a situation that neither of them was explaining clearly. Her anxiety was understandable and entirely undeserved. She hadn't chosen this conflict, hadn't participated in the escalation that led to Andrew's current predicament. I'm sure it's routine, I said. Military bureaucracy generates a lot of paperwork. Most of it's administrative. But even as I said it, I knew Sarah was too smart to believe the deflection. She could hear the evasion in my voice, could sense that I knew more about her husband's situation than I was willing to discuss. That knowledge would create its own problems, its own tensions in their marriage, its own questions about loyalty and transparency. Andrew had created this situation by insisting on public confrontation, by making our conflict visible to the family, by forcing everyone to choose sides in a dispute that could have been handled privately. Now Sarah was dealing with the consequences of his decision, caught between competing loyalties and incomplete information. I need to go, she said. He's home, and he looks like he needs to talk. After she hung up, I sat thinking about collateral damage, about the ways conflict spreads beyond its original participants to affect innocent bystanders. Sarah hadn't asked to be part of this, hadn't contributed to the tension between Andrew and me, hadn't deserved to be put in a position where she had to navigate between her husband's fears and her brother's silence. But that was Andrew's choice too. He could have handled his insecurities privately, could have addressed his concerns about military service and civilian courage through conversation rather than confrontation. Instead, he'd chosen to make it a public test, to use family dinner as a stage for demonstrating his dominance, to force everyone present to witness his challenge and my response. Now he was learning that public challenges receive public responses, that authority demonstrated privately is different from authority exercised publicly, that the consequences of miscalculating someone's position can extend far beyond the original miscalculation. The deployment orders were already in motion, processed through channels that didn't recognize personal regret or second thoughts. Andrew could make phone calls, could try to find someone willing to reverse decisions made through proper protocols, could attempt to negotiate his way out of consequences he'd unknowingly triggered. But he'd discover what I'd learned years ago, that real authority doesn't negotiate with people who challenge it publicly, doesn't make exceptions for people who mistake restraint for weakness, doesn't accommodate people who confuse following orders with cowardice. The system that had trained me, promoted me, trusted me with significant responsibilities, would now provide Andrew with the same opportunities for growth, the same tests of character, the same education in the difference between theoretical courage and practical competence. Whether he'd appreciate the education remained to be seen. Whether Sarah would forgive both of us for the way it had developed was a more complicated question, one that would probably take longer to resolve than Andrew's deployment itself. But some lessons can't be learned through explanation. Sometimes people need to experience consequences directly, to test their assumptions against reality, to discover whether their definitions of strength and courage hold up under conditions where those qualities matter for more than just family dinner conversation. Andrew had asked for that test. Now he was going to receive it, complete and comprehensive, with all the educational value that comes from discovering the difference between talking about courage and actually needing it. I respected him enough to let him have that experience. The rest was up to him. The weekend arrived with unseasonable warmth, the kind of spring day that makes people want to spend time outdoors, to open windows and make plans. I'd spent Saturday morning in my garden, thinking about cycles, planting and growth, patience and eventual harvest, the way some investments of effort don't show results for months or years. Andrew called Sunday afternoon. The first time we'd spoken directly since the dinner, the first time he'd initiated contact with me in months. His voice was different, careful, controlled, missing the casual confidence that usually characterized our interactions. "I got some papers on Thursday," he said. "Military orders. Deployment assignment." I waited. Let him fill the silence. "I was wondering if you might know something about how these things work. The process, I mean. Whether there are procedures for reviewing decisions." Still careful, still controlled. Andrew was smart enough to understand that this conversation was being conducted under different rules now, that the casual disrespect he'd shown at dinner wasn't going to work when he needed something from me. "Deployment orders go through multiple levels of review before they're issued," I said. "Personnel command, operational planning, resource allocation. By the time someone receives them, they've been vetted thoroughly. But mistakes happen, right? Wrong person, wrong timing, administrative errors. Rarely. The system is designed to minimize those kinds of problems." Long pause. When Andrew spoke again, his voice was tighter, less controlled. "This feels like more than coincidence. The timing." "What timing?" "You know what timing. Sunday dinner, then Thursday I get orders for combat deployment. That's not random." I could hear the fear underneath his words, the growing realization that he'd miscalculated badly, that his challenge to my authority had been answered with a demonstration of exactly what that authority looked like when exercised. But I could also hear something else, a request for negotiation, an opening for discussion about how this situation might be resolved. "Andrew, deployment orders are based on operational needs and personnel availability. If you received orders, it's because someone determined you're qualified and available for the assignment. Someone like you? The question hung between us, direct finally, past the careful dancing around what we both knew had happened. Andrew was asking me to acknowledge my role, to admit that this was personal rather than procedural, to engage with him on the level where this conflict had actually been taking place. Someone like personnel command, based on recommendations from field commanders who understand current staffing needs. That's not an answer. It's the only answer that matters. The orders are legitimate, properly authorized, and operationally necessary. Everything else is speculation. I could hear him breathing, processing the implications of what I wasn't saying directly. Andrew was learning the difference between civilian conflict, where motivations are discussed and negotiated, and military efficiency, where results matter more than explanations. What if I told you I was wrong? About Sunday, about the things I said. Now we were getting to the heart of it. Andrew was offering an apology, a recognition that he'd overstepped, a request for reconsideration based on his new understanding of the situation. In civilian relationships, this might be enough: acknowledgement of error, expression of regret, implicit promise to behave differently in the future. But this wasn't a civilian relationship anymore. Andrew had invoked concepts like courage and cowardice, had challenged not just my personal character, but my professional competence, had done so publicly in a way that required public resolution. Private apologies don't address public challenges. I'd tell you that personal opinions don't affect operational requirements, I said. If you're qualified for deployment, you're qualified regardless of what you think about military service or the people who provide it. Come on. We both know this isn't about operational requirements. We both know that what you think this is about doesn't matter to the people who cut your orders. Andrew went quiet. When he spoke again, his voice was different, smaller, more desperate. I have a wife, responsibilities. I can't just disappear for months, maybe years. Then you should have considered those responsibilities before making public statements about other people's courage. The words came out harsher than I'd intended, more revealing of personal investment than I'd wanted to show. But Andrew had finally pushed past my professional detachment, had reminded me that this wasn't just about abstract principles, but about family, about the people I cared about the disrespect he'd shown not just to me but to everyone who'd served. Everyone who'd sacrificed, everyone who'd earned their understanding of courage through experience rather than speculation. Sarah doesn't deserve this, he said. No, she doesn't. She deserves a husband who thinks before he speaks, who considers consequences before he acts, who respects the people she loves instead of using family gatherings to demonstrate his dominance. Another silence. Then, what do you want? An apology? Public acknowledgement that I was wrong? What would it take for you to make this go away? I want you to report for deployment as ordered and learn what courage actually means when it's tested by something more serious than family dinner conversation. And if I refuse? Then you'll learn what military justice looks like when applied to people who ignore lawful orders. Andrew hung up without another word. I sat in my garden for another hour, thinking about the conversation, about the shift in Andrew's tone from careful negotiation to desperate bargaining to final recognition that he was dealing with consequences he couldn't talk his way out of. He'd finally understood that this wasn't a civilian dispute that could be resolved through discussion and compromise, but a military operation that would proceed according to its own logic regardless of his personal preferences. The transformation had been instructive. Andrew, at the beginning of the call, still believing he could manage the situation through the same kind of social manipulation he'd used successfully in other contexts. Andrew, at the end of the call, recognizing that he was facing a system that didn't care about his charm, his connections, his ability to reframe situations to his advantage. Sarah called that evening, crying. He told me about the deployment. 6 months, maybe longer. Combat zone. I listened to her describe the conversation, Andrew's explanation that he'd been selected for deployment, that the orders were non-negotiable, that he'd be leaving within the month. He'd presented it as something that had happened to him rather than something he'd provoked, had positioned himself as the victim of military bureaucracy rather than the instigator of military response. He says you're behind this somehow, that you used your influence to get him assigned. What do you think? Long pause. I think Andrew said some things at dinner that he shouldn't have said. I think he's been saying things about you for months that he shouldn't have said. I think maybe he finally said them to the wrong person. Sarah was connecting the dots, understanding the progression from private disrespect to public challenge to official consequences. She was also beginning to understand that her husband's deployment wasn't something that had happened to him, but something he'd brought on himself through his own choices, his own miscalculations, his own inability to recognize when he was outmatched. "Are you angry with me?" I asked. "I'm angry with both of you. With him for being stupid, with you for being efficient." Efficient. It was an accurate description of what had happened, more accurate than Andrew's version of events. I hadn't acted out of anger or personal vendetta, but out of a cold assessment of what would most effectively address the situation he'd created. Andrew had tested my authority publicly. I'd demonstrated that authority practically. Andrew had questioned my courage theoretically. I'd provided him with an opportunity to test his own courage practically. "He's scared," Sarah said. "Really scared. I've never seen him like this." Fear is useful. It indicates accurate assessment of risk. That's a terrible thing to say about your brother-in-law. It's an honest thing to say about someone who's about to learn the difference between talking about courage and needing it. Sarah was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was tired, resigned. "You're not going to fix this, are you? You're not going to make it go away." "I can't fix something Andrew broke when he decided to challenge me publicly. And I won't make it go away because he needs to learn what he's been asking questions about. What if something happens to him? What if he gets hurt or killed?" It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself since I'd made the initial call. Andrew would be entering a dangerous environment, would be exposed to risks that were real and potentially fatal. His deployment wasn't punishment, but it was consequence, and consequences in combat zones could be permanent. "Then he'll have learned what military service actually costs," I said. "What courage actually requires. What following orders actually means when the orders are designed to keep people alive in situations where making your own decisions gets them killed." "You sound like you don't care whether he comes back." "I care whether he comes back better than he left. Whether he understands what he was talking about when he called me a coward. Whether he respects what other people have sacrificed when he gets back to civilian life." Sarah hung up without saying goodbye. I spent the rest of the evening thinking about family relationships, about the ways conflict changes people's understanding of each other, about the difference between being right and being kind. I'd been right about Andrew, had accurately assessed his character and his need for education. But I hadn't been kind to Sarah, hadn't considered how my efficiency would affect someone who loved both of us, who hadn't chosen to be caught between our conflict. That was a cost I hadn't calculated properly, a consequence I hadn't anticipated when I decided to demonstrate my authority rather than simply ignore Andrew's challenge. Sarah was paying a price for my decision to respond, was dealing with her own questions about loyalty and family and the people she thought she knew. But some lessons can't be learned without cost, and some costs are worth paying for the education they provide. Andrew was about to discover what courage actually meant when tested by reality rather than measured against family dinner conversation. Sarah was about to discover what kind of man she'd married when he was stripped of his familiar supports and forced to rely on his own competence and character. And I was about to discover whether my understanding of justice and education could survive the reality of sending someone I was supposed to care about into harm's way for the sake of teaching him lessons he should have learned before he challenged my authority publicly. The deployment orders were final, the timeline was set, the consequences were in motion. Now we'd all learn together what we were actually made of when the stakes were real. Andrew left on a Tuesday morning in early May. I wasn't there to see him off. That would have been unnecessarily theatrical, a final demonstration of power that served no educational purpose. Sarah had asked me to stay away, and I'd respected her request. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about Andrew and what he'd learn about himself in an environment where his assumptions about courage and leadership would be tested by reality rather than evaluated by people with their own reasons for accommodating his behavior. The first month passed quietly. Sarah called occasionally, short conversations about practical matters, insurance paperwork, power of attorney documents, the logistics of managing a household when your spouse is deployed overseas. She didn't ask about Andrew's situation, didn't request updates on his status, didn't seek reassurance about his safety. Our conversations were professional, efficient, carefully emptied of emotional content. I respected her approach. Sarah was processing the situation in her own way, dealing with the reality that her husband was in a combat zone, that her brother had put him there, that both of the men she loved had chosen conflict over compromise. She was learning her own lessons about loyalty and family and the ways people reveal their true nature when tested by circumstances beyond their control. The reports I received through official channels were routine. Andrew had completed his initial orientation, had been assigned to a logistics unit responsible for supply coordination in a forward operating base. Not frontline combat, but close enough to danger that the theoretical courage he'd been discussing at family dinners would be tested regularly by real threats, real responsibilities, real consequences for failure. His performance evaluations were adequate. Not exceptional, not problematic, just adequate. He was following orders, completing assignments, adapting to military discipline without major incidents. The swagger that had characterized his civilian behavior was gone, replaced by the careful confidence of someone learning to navigate an environment where overconfidence could get people killed. In June, Sarah called with news that Andrew had been promoted to a position with more responsibility. "He sounds different when we talk," she said. "More serious." "Less." She paused, searching for the right word. "Less certain about everything." That was interesting. Andrew had built his civilian identity around certainty, around his ability to assess situations quickly and make confident decisions. Military service was teaching him the difference between confidence and competence, between making decisions and making good decisions, between being certain and being right. "How are you doing with all of this?" I asked. "I'm learning things about myself too," Sarah said. "About what I can handle on my own, about what I actually need from a partner versus what I thought I needed." She didn't elaborate, but I understood. Andrew's deployment had forced Sarah to discover her own capabilities, to manage responsibilities she'd previously shared or delegated, to develop independence she hadn't known she possessed. In some ways, his absence was as educational for her as his presence in a combat zone was for him. "Do you hate me for what I did?" Long pause. "I hated how you did it. The coldness, the efficiency. The way you could just rearrange someone's life because they insulted you. And now? Now I think maybe Andrew needed to learn some things he couldn't learn here. And maybe I needed to learn some things about myself that I couldn't learn while he was around." It was an honest assessment, more generous than I deserved. Sarah was finding ways to extract value from a situation she hadn't chosen, to grow from circumstances that had been imposed on her by the conflict between her husband and her brother. July brought the first real test. Andrew's unit had been assigned to escort a supply convoy through territory where insurgent activity was increasing. Not the most dangerous assignment possible, but dangerous enough that success would require exactly the kind of courage Andrew had been theorizing about at family dinners, not the dramatic, individual heroism of movies, but the steady competence of people doing difficult jobs under pressure because other people were depending on them. The mission was successful. The convoy reached its destination, delivered its supplies, returned without casualties. Andrew had performed his duties adequately, had followed orders precisely, had contributed to an operation that achieved its objectives. Nothing heroic, nothing dramatic, just professional competence under circumstances where incompetence would have had serious consequences. But something had changed. The next time Sarah spoke to him, she told me he'd mentioned the convoy mission, had described it not as an adventure or a test of courage, but as work, difficult, important work that required preparation, training, and careful execution. The theoretical discussions about civilian versus military courage had been replaced by practical appreciation for the people who'd trained him, equipped him, and trusted him with responsibilities that affected other people's lives. "He asked about you," Sarah said. "Wanted to know if you'd heard about the mission, what you thought about his performance." "What did you tell him?" "I told him to ask you himself." But Andrew didn't call. Instead, he sent a letter, handwritten, formal, the kind of communication you send when you want to say something important carefully rather than spontaneously. The letter was brief, direct, completely different in tone from our last phone conversation. He acknowledged that he'd been wrong about military service, about the nature of courage, about the people who choose to serve in combat zones. He recognized that his comments at family dinner had been ignorant and disrespectful. He understood that his deployment was consequence rather than coincidence, and he accepted responsibility for the choices that had led to it. Most importantly, he thanked me. Not for the deployment itself, but for the education it had provided, for the opportunity to test his assumptions against reality, for the chance to discover what he was actually capable of when challenged by circumstances that demanded confidence rather than rewarding confidence. The letter was signed simply, without the casual familiarity or the formal distance that had characterized our previous communications. Just his name, acknowledging the change in our relationship, the shift from antagonism to something more complex, not friendship, exactly, but mutual respect based on shared understanding of what had been tested and learned. I kept the letter but didn't respond immediately. Andrew was still deployed, still learning, still discovering the difference between talking about courage and demonstrating it. Our conversation could wait until he returned, until he'd completed his education, and we could both assess what had been accomplished, what had been changed, what had been lost and gained through the experience. Sarah was changing too, developing confidence and independence that hadn't been visible when Andrew was around to manage decisions and control conversations. She was discovering her own strengths, her own judgment, her own ability to navigate challenges without someone else defining what she was capable of handling. The family dynamic was shifting, rebalancing around new understanding of who we all were, what we were capable of, what we respected about each other. Andrew's deployment had started as consequence for his disrespect, but it was becoming something more comprehensive, an education for all of us about courage, about authority, about the ways people reveal their true nature when tested by circumstances beyond their comfortable control. When Andrew returned, we'd all be different people than we'd been before this started. Whether we'd be better people remained to be seen. But we'd be people who understood each other more accurately, who'd tested our assumptions against reality, who'd learned what we were actually made of when the stakes were real rather than theoretical. That was worth something. Whether it was worth the cost we'd all paid to learn it was a question that would probably take years to answer definitively. Andrew came home in October, on a day when the leaves were just beginning to turn and there was a hint of winter in the morning air. I wasn't at the airport. Sarah had asked for privacy for their reunion, and I'd respected that request. But she called that evening to let me know he'd arrived safely, that he looked different but seemed well, that they had a lot to talk about. "He wants to see you," she said. "When he's ready. When we've had time to re-establish things." I told her to take whatever time they needed. There was no urgency now, no conflict requiring immediate resolution. Andrew had completed his deployment, had served honorably, had earned his education in the difference between theoretical and practical courage. Whatever conversation we needed to have could wait until he was ready to have it. 3 weeks later, he called. His voice was different, quieter, more measured, missing the casual confidence that had once characterized everything he said. Military service had taught him the value of precision in communication, of saying what you mean and meaning what you say. "I'd like to take you to lunch," he said. "If you're willing. There are things I need to say, and I'd rather say them in person." We met at a restaurant downtown, the kind of place with white tablecloths and quiet corners where conversations could be held without interruption. Andrew was already there when I arrived, sitting at a table by the window, watching people walk by on the sidewalk. He looked older, not dramatically but noticeably, the kind of aging that comes from responsibility rather than time, from carrying weight rather than simply accumulating years. He stood when I approached, extended his hand for a formal handshake. "Thank you for coming." We ordered lunch, made small talk about the weather, about Sarah's work, about his readjustment to civilian life. But underneath the pleasantries was a tension, a sense that we were both preparing for a conversation that would define our relationship going forward. Finally, Andrew set down his fork and looked at me directly. "I owe you an apology. Not just for Sunday dinner, but for months of disrespect, of testing you, of treating your service and your sacrifice as something I could dismiss or diminish." I waited. Let him continue. I thought I understood what courage meant. I thought military service was about following orders, about letting other people make decisions for you. I thought civilian life required more independence, more personal strength. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I was wrong about all of that. What did you learn? I learned that following orders is harder than giving them when the orders are designed to keep people alive in situations where one mistake can kill your entire unit. I learned that military discipline isn't about mindless obedience, but about trusting people who have more experience and better information to make decisions that serve objectives larger than your personal preferences. Andrew was speaking with the precision of someone who'd thought carefully about what he wanted to say, who'd tested his words against his experience to make sure they were accurate rather than just apologetic. I learned that courage isn't about making your own decisions in safe environments, but about executing other people's decisions competently when the stakes are real. I learned that the people I was deployed with, people like you, had earned their authority through demonstrated competence under pressure, not through rank or politics or favoritism. He paused, took a sip of water, continued. I learned that calling someone a coward without understanding what they've actually done, what they've actually sacrificed, what they've actually accomplished, isn't courage. It's ignorance. The apology was comprehensive, thoughtful, completely different from the desperate bargaining he'd attempted during our phone conversation before his deployment. Andrew had used his time overseas to think seriously about what had happened between us, to understand not just that he'd been wrong but why he'd been wrong, what assumptions had led to his miscalculation. I also learned something else, he said. I learned that you could have handled this differently. You could have called me out publicly, could have embarrassed me the way I tried to embarrass you. You could have used your authority to make my life difficult in ways that had nothing to do with military service. I nodded. That was accurate. There had been other options, other ways to respond to his challenge that would have been more personally satisfying, more dramatically confrontational, more obviously connected to my wounded pride. Instead, you gave me exactly what I was asking for: the chance to test my theories about courage against reality, to discover what military service actually requires, to learn whether my definitions of strength and cowardice held up under real pressure. Andrew was giving me credit for educational intention that had only partially motivated my decision. I'd wanted him deployed partly because I thought he needed to learn those lessons, but also because I'd been angry, because I'd wanted him to face consequences for his disrespect, because I'd wanted to demonstrate my authority in ways that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. That took a different kind of courage, he continued. The courage to let someone learn hard lessons instead of protecting them from the consequences of their own choices. The courage to accept being seen as vindictive or cruel in order to provide education that couldn't be delivered through conversation. How is Sarah handling your return? Andrew smiled, the first genuine expression I'd seen from him since he'd come home. She's different too. Stronger, more independent. She told me about some of the conversations you had while I was gone, about how you helped her think through her work problems, gave her advice about handling her boss. I remembered those calls, Sarah's growing confidence as she learned to trust her own judgment, her gradual recognition that the dismissal and undermining she'd been experiencing from Andrew wasn't normal or acceptable in a healthy relationship. She said you treated her concerns as legitimate, her professional judgment as valuable, her struggles as problems to be solved rather than evidence of weakness. That had been natural for me, the obvious way to respond to someone I cared about who was facing difficulties. But Andrew was recognizing it as a contrast to his own approach, an example of how respect and support actually looked when practiced rather than just claimed. I realize now that I wasn't being a good husband. I was trying to be the strong one, the decision maker, the person who knew better about everything. I thought leadership meant having opinions about other people's problems and solutions for other people's struggles. Andrew was learning the difference between leadership and dominance, between strength and control, between supporting someone and managing them. Military service had taught him those distinctions through direct experience with people who embodied real leadership rather than just claiming authority they hadn't earned. What happens now? I asked. Now I figure out how to be the kind of husband Sarah deserves, the kind of man who supports her strengths instead of managing her weaknesses. I figure out how to contribute to this family instead of trying to control it. He paused. And I hope you'll give me the chance to earn your respect instead of just demanding it. Andrew was asking for something different than he'd asked for before his deployment. Not forgiveness, exactly, and not a return to the previous dynamic where his behavior was accommodated for the sake of family harmony. He was asking for the opportunity to demonstrate change rather than just claim it, to build a new relationship based on mutual respect rather than inherited obligation. I'd like that, I said. We finished lunch, shook hands again, parted with the understanding that this was a beginning rather than an ending. Andrew had learned what he needed to learn about courage, about respect, about the difference between confidence and confidence. Now he needed to figure out how to apply that education to civilian life, to his marriage, to his role in our family. That would take time, patience, consistent demonstration of change rather than dramatic gestures or promises. But he'd proven he was capable of learning, of growth, of accepting responsibility for his mistakes and working to correct them. Sarah called that evening to thank me for giving Andrew the chance to apologize, for listening to what he'd learned, for being willing to consider rebuilding our relationship based on who he was now rather than who he'd been before his deployment. He's different, she said. Better. More thoughtful. More respectful of what other people bring to conversations instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. That was the real victory, not Andrew's apology to me, but his recognition of how his behavior had affected Sarah, how his need to demonstrate dominance had diminished her confidence and independence. Military service had taught him to see leadership as service rather than control, to understand that real authority comes from earning trust rather than demanding deference. The family dynamic was rebalancing around new understanding of who we all were, what we respected about each other, what we were willing to accept, and what we were capable of changing. Andrew's deployment had started as consequence, but had become education for him, for Sarah, for all of us. We were different people now than we'd been before this started. Better people, I thought. People who understood each other more accurately, who'd tested our assumptions against reality, who'd learned what we were actually made of when the stakes were real. That was worth the cost we'd all paid to learn it. Worth the months of tension and uncertainty, worth the risk and the fear, worth the temporary damage to relationships that had needed to change anyway. Andrew had called me a coward and learned what courage actually meant. I'd responded with authority and learned something about the responsibility that comes with power. Sarah had been caught in the middle and discovered her own strength. None of us were the same people we'd been at that Sunday dinner when everything started. We were people who'd been tested and had grown from the testing, who understood each other and ourselves more clearly, who'd earned the respect we were now prepared to give each other. The education was complete. The rebuilding could begin. And that's how one word, coward, changed everything. Sometimes silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. What about you? Have you ever had to let someone face the consequences of their own arrogance? Did standing your ground earn you respect or cost you relationships? Share your experience below. I'd love to hear it. If this story resonated, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more true stories about boundaries, respect, and quiet justice.